Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western observers were wary of its tank force. Russia had the largest tank fleet in the world with 12,556 units. This number was more than its closest rivals North Korea and the United States combined. Meanwhile, Russia's rival Ukraine had only about 1,900 tanks before the war began. The numbers looked hopelessly bad for the Ukrainians. However, numbers aren't everything, and the war in Ukraine proved it. In this video, we'll look at how Russia has lost thousands of tanks in its special military operation, how it deceived the world with its number of tanks, and how its tank failures have been systematic in everything from doctrine to design. Russia started the war with disadvantages. Despite its formidable tank fleet on paper, only about 2,600 of Russia's armored units were main battle tanks, defined as a heavily armored tank that is designed to provide direct firepower in head-on combat. For example, the M1 Abrams and its derivatives fit this role for the United States. Other armored vehicles like the M2 Bradley play important parts on the battlefield, but they are not designed to get into direct combat with enemy tanks or heavily fortified positions, so they are not called main battle tanks. To make matters worse for Russia, only about a quarter of its pre-war main battle tanks had modern sighting and fire control systems. These were the T-72B3 B3M, the T-80 BVM, and the T-90 AM. Worse still, by November 2022, Colin Kahl, the United States Undersecretary for Defense Policy, estimated that Russia had lost half of its pre-war main battle tanks in Ukraine. A year later, the Oryx blog estimates that Russia has lost a total of 2,478 tanks, with 1,621 destroyed, 139 damaged, 170 abandoned, and 548 captured. As a percentage, about 65% of Russia's total tank losses have come through the destruction of its armored units. Ukraine, meanwhile, has lost 689 tanks, with 462 destroyed, 56 damaged, 37 abandoned, and 134 captured. This makes for a Russia to Ukraine casualty ratio of 3.5 to 1. The ratio of tanks lost to destruction between Russia and Ukraine is also 3.5 to 1. However, Ukraine is suffering as well, as 67% of its total tank losses have been through outright destruction rather than damage or abandonment, comparable to the Russian figure. Experts note that Oryx's estimates of the equipment losses on both sides are often a bare minimum, and the real losses are likely higher. Even so, the general picture would remain correct. Even though destruction percentages are similar, Russia is losing tanks at a more rapid rate than Ukraine, and many of the tanks that both sides are using have great flaws. Why have so many tanks on both sides been destroyed, compared to being merely damaged or abandoned? Part of the reason is that Russian tanks are prone to catastrophic damage. Unlike Western tanks like the Abrams, Challenger 2, and Leopard 2, Russian tanks do not compartmentalize their ammunition. Instead, some of the tank's shells are stored in the turret. If the tank gets hit, even indirectly, it can start a chain reaction that results in the entire magazine exploding, creating a jack-in-the-box effect so often seen in Ukraine. Some anti-tank weapons, like the American Javelin, are designed to send their projectiles on an arc that impacts the turret of an enemy tank, which has weaker armor than the body. The result is devastating. Russian tanks suffering from jack-in-the-box explosions did not come as a surprise to Western military experts. They had observed the same effect in the Gulf War, when large numbers of Iraqi T-72 tanks were totaled after their turrets got hit by anti-tank weapons. Russia's other supposedly modern tanks, the T-80 and T-90, have the same design flaw. The T-90 entered service in the Russian military in 1992, but its designers did not learn anything from the Gulf War. As of November 2023, the Oryx blog has estimated that, of visually confirmed cases, Russia has lost 1,270 T-72 type tanks across multiple variants. Of these, 815 have been destroyed, a destruction rate of 64%. Meanwhile, Russia has lost 669 T-80 tanks across multiple variants, with 419 of them being destroyed, making for a destruction rate of 62%. Russia has lost 92 of the different types of T-90. Of these, 55 have been destroyed, a rate of about 60%. Russia has also lost 285 other tanks that Oryx could not identify. Of these, 241 were destroyed, making for a staggering 84.5% destruction rate. While Ukraine has gotten much media attention for its newfound use of Western main battle tanks like the Abrams, Challenger, and Leopard, most of the units in its armored fleet are still Soviet and Russian-designed tanks. Before the conflict, it had about 900 Soviet-made T-64, T-72, and T-80 tanks. Most of these were of the T-64 class. Of these tanks across multiple variants, Ukraine has a total of 376. Of these 376, 241 were destroyed, a rate of 64%. Ukraine has also deployed different tanks of the T-72 class and lost 186 of them, with 132 of them being destroyed, a destruction rate of 71%. 56 Ukrainian T-80s have been lost in combat. 39 of them were destroyed outright, a destruction rate of 69%. In contrast, Ukraine has seen the destruction of just one of the 14 Challenger tanks it's deployed in combat. Meanwhile, of the 25 Leopard tanks that have become casualties in Ukraine, only 9 have seen outright destruction, a rate of 36%. The others were damaged, abandoned, or both. This discrepancy in the destruction rate between Soviet, Russian, and Western tank designs is because the latter's militaries learned from the experience in Iraq. The Abrams, for example, has its ammunition magazine in a sealed compartment. One of the tank's 4 crew members retrieves rounds from this compartment, unsealing and resealing the magazine with each shot. This setup means that if the tank is hit, only one of its rounds is likely to be exposed in the turret. This can damage the tank, but the crew is relatively well protected from enemy fire, and there is far less of a chance of a chain reaction that produces the jack-in-the-box effect. Russia did seem to finally learn the lesson when it designed its latest tank, the T-14 Armata. Unlike the earlier Soviet-produced designs, the T-14 has an armored protected crew capsule, which is completely separate from the ammunition magazine thanks to the tank's auto-loader. Unfortunately for Russia, only about 20 of these units have been produced, far from the 100 that were supposedly in the works with a contract announcement in 2020. Because of international sanctions, logistics, and perennial corruption problems in the Russian military, it's unlikely that Russia will be able to produce many more T-14 tanks anytime soon. Meanwhile, the Armata has never been definitively confirmed as participating in a combat operation in Ukraine. Claims that it has been deployed to the battlefield are likely based on Russian propaganda trying to save face and prevent their country's tank reputation from falling any further. It is likely that the Russian military fears losing the few Armata tanks it's been able to produce. For Russia, the lack of the T-14 Armata also means that it lacks a truly modern main battle tank. Even Russia's supposedly most advanced tank that it can produce in large enough numbers, the T-90, is still based on the T-72, a model which saw its genesis in the late 1960s. Aside from their superior survivability designs, one of the reasons that relatively few of the Western main battle tanks deployed in Ukraine have been destroyed is because their Russian opponents lack the firepower to threaten them. The T-14 Armata was developed with an improved 2A82IM 125mm cannon, which Western military experts conceded was a significant improvement over the guns on the T-72, T-80, and T-90, despite the Armata's other problems. However, this weapon is not backward compatible with Russia's traditional tanks because the breech block does not fit, meaning that the Kremlin cannot deploy it to Ukraine. If the Russians could find a way to field this weapon, the casualty ratio between Ukrainian and Russian tanks might not be so lopsided, but like in many other matters, Russia's poor preparedness for the conflict meant that this problem was overlooked. Additionally, Russia's tank guns have limited mobility. The T-90, for example, can only raise its gun to an arc of 14 degrees or lower it to an arc of 6. In contrast, the Abrams can raise its gun by 20 degrees or lower it by 9. This gives the Abrams greater range than its Russian competitor. The lack of mobility for Russian tank guns also makes them vulnerable in urban combat, contributing to Russian tank losses in Ukraine just as it did in Chechnya. So Russia began the war in Ukraine with a largely outdated series of tanks with design problems that made them prone to catastrophic destruction and ensured that they would lack range and firepower. Because Ukraine started the war with the same kind of outdated tanks, it suffered an armor destruction ratio comparable to its Russian adversary. However, as Ukraine received thousands of modern portable anti-tank weapons like the Javelin, it was able to pile up the damage on Russian tanks in other ways. Russia's staggering losses of its more modern tanks like the T-72, T-80, and T-90 have forced it to dig deeper into its tank fleet and break older models out of storage. The older tanks include the T-64 models that Ukraine has been using, which were designed in the early 1960s. Russia has also used the T-62 tank, the T-64's predecessor, which saw its origins in the 1950s, and even in some cases the T-54-55, which had its genesis in the 1940s as a successor to the legendary World War II-era T-34. These old tanks have been deployed in Ukraine without any visible upgrades, such as bricks of explosive reactive armor to better protect them from anti-tank rounds. Perhaps it's for this reason that Russian sources indicate that the T-54-55 tanks in particular have been deployed more as mobile armored artillery vehicles designed for indirect fire assistance. This role seems corroborated by Oryx, as only 2 T-54-55 type tanks have been reported as visually confirmed casualties, despite their lack of protective armor against modern weapons. One of the tanks was destroyed and the other damaged. Russian sources reported in May 2023 that the T-54-55 has been deployed to Ukraine at the company level. Like other tanks in Ukraine, T-54-55 models have been spotted with cope cages as an ad hoc method to protect against drones and anti-tank missiles. Russia originally wanted the T-62 and its variants in the indirect role that the T-54-55 has been deployed in, but the huge losses of T-72 tanks have forced it to usher in this old tank and the T-64 into frontline direct combat in larger numbers, putting it in the same position as its enemy Ukraine was at the start of the war. According to Oryx, Russia has lost 85 T-62 tanks across its multiple variants, 35 of which have been destroyed, a rate of about 41%. Meanwhile, Russia has lost 78 T-64 tanks, 60 of which have been destroyed, making for a much higher destruction rate of about 77%. The destruction of so many Russian tanks in Ukraine has led to a peculiar phenomenon. As Russia is breaking its Cold War relics out of storage, its Ukrainian enemy is getting a steady supply of Western tanks, which are much more highly survivable and come with more firepower. For example, as damaged Leopard tanks get repaired, more could be coming from Europe in 2024. Germany has pledged that an additional 14 Leopard tanks will be delivered in early 2024 to replace the ones Ukraine has lost. Meanwhile, in November 2023, Germany and Switzerland made a deal to send even more Leopard tanks to Ukraine, adding to the latter's fleet, according to a report by David Axe in Forbes. In the late 1980s, Switzerland bought 380 PZ-87 tanks, which are variants of the Leopard 2A4. While Switzerland upgraded some of these tanks in the 2010s, it put 96 unmodified tanks in storage. Ukraine has long desired these. But Switzerland has centuries of tradition of being a neutral country. Then, on November 22, 2023, the Swiss agreed to export 25 of these tanks to the German Rheinmetall Company, which manufactures automobiles and arms. Technically, the condition the Swiss demanded is that these tanks must remain in NATO or EU territory to meet existing shortfalls. However, there is a loophole that the Swiss gave a wink and a nod to. Rheinmetall is empowered to sell these tanks to a country that already operates Leopard 2A4s, perhaps with German government financing, and that country could then donate to Ukraine its own Leopard 2A4s. So Rheinmetall could sell these tanks to Germany, for example. Germany would then be able to donate them to Ukraine. If these 25 tanks were to arrive in conjunction with the 14 Germany has already pledged, it would make up for the destroyed Leopards and then some, amounting to a new battalion of tanks. As Ukraine's tank force gets steadily more modern, Russia is finding it more and more difficult to replace its best tanks, and as a result, its tank force is getting older and more vulnerable to modern weapons. These older tanks are often not even able to fight at night, unlike the newer Western tanks that are coming into the service of Ukraine. This reality paints a grim picture for Russia as the war continues into its third year. It will need to rely more and more on throwing sheer numbers at the problems facing it. However, Russia's tank problems in Ukraine go far beyond old models and design flaws. While many tanks have been destroyed, many others have been lost due to capture or abandonment. Russian doctrine heavily emphasizes tanks and artillery. In comparison, Western doctrine emphasizes a combined arms approach to warfare. Urban fighting in Iraq helped to flesh this doctrine out. Tanks proved vulnerable without proper infantry support, especially in tighter environments like cities. As a result, dismounted infantry proved critical to supporting the tanks. Russia, on the other hand, learned nothing from its bitter experiences in the Chechen wars of the 1990s, where guerrillas armed with anti-tank weapons would wreak havoc on the Russian armor from rooftops, high windows, or when emerging from basements. When Russia deployed its vast tank fleet to Ukraine, it again failed to provide its tanks with proper infantry support, learning nothing from its experiences in Chechnya. Long columns of Russian tanks without proper infantry support, often in urban settings, proved vulnerable to the ambushes of Ukrainian anti-tank crews. As we've seen, because of their tanks' design problems, many of Russia's best tank crews became casualties in the earliest phases of the war, when Russia's attacks stalled outside of Kyiv and every other axis except in the southern one that emerged from Crimea. Russian tanks typically come in crews of 3: the commander, driver, and gunner. If we take the visually confirmed loss estimates by Oryx and multiply the 1,621 tanks destroyed by 3, it would yield a number of 4,863 tank crews becoming casualties in Ukraine. Because Russian tanks tend to blow up in catastrophic destruction thanks to their design flaws, most of these can be assumed to be KIA. These numbers are only rough estimates. They may be higher or lower. Ukrainian sources claimed in the summer of 2023 that Russia has lost over 4,000 tanks in the war. Although because this information is coming from a warring party, it must be treated with skepticism. It is noteworthy, though, that foreign experts have often roughly agreed with Ukraine's figures. For example, Frederick Martins of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies said they were probable in an interview with Newsweek. Regardless, the loss of Russian tank crews has been high because of the thousands of tanks destroyed. Since Russia almost certainly lost thousands of its best-trained tank operators in the early stages of the war, it's had to replace them with poorly trained and motivated new recruits. Much like their mobilized infantry counterparts in places like Bakhmut, Russia's modus operandi has simply been to throw these amateurish crews and outdated tanks into the teeth of the enemy. Russia's problems go further. According to Oryx, at least 176 tanks have been abandoned, and a further 548 captured. The real number is probably higher. In contrast, only 37 Ukrainian tanks have been abandoned and 133 captured, ratios of 4.75 to 1 and 4.1 to 1 in favor of Ukraine. Why have the Russians lost so many tanks to abandonment? One of the reasons is that Russia has had problems deploying retrieval vehicles into Ukraine. These vehicles are designed to recover immobilized or damaged armored equipment. The comparative lack of these recovery vehicles in the Russian military is nothing new and date back to the Soviet era. According to Oryx, Russia has lost a total of 88 armored recovery vehicles. 39 of them have been destroyed and the rest damaged or abandoned. Ukrainian forces have often been seen targeting Russian recovery vehicles with drones. Each loss adds even greater stress to Russia's armed forces. Meanwhile, Ukraine is converting some of its older T-62 tanks into armored recovery vehicles to assist its newer Western tanks. Russian problems go deeper still. Many tanks have needed to be abandoned because of a lack of spare parts or proper mechanics to service them. A comparison with the US military might bring things into perspective. The US Army deploys about 10 support soldiers for every combat soldier to maintain smooth logistics. The Russian Army in Ukraine has had far fewer support soldiers, with only about 150 in a typical battalion tactical group being in that category. Each BTG has about 700 to 900 soldiers. Russia, despite being one of the world's leading energy producers, has also suffered fuel shortages in Ukraine. Lack of access to rail hubs that it needs to move equipment and clogged roads have made it hard for Russia to keep its tanks fueled. Ukraine's HIMARS attacks on Russian fuel depots and other important logistical centers have only added greater stress to Russia's tank problems, especially with their constant lack of proper infantry support. In sum, Russia's tank failure in Ukraine is the result of all things coming together. Outdated Soviet-era designs make Russian tanks prone to complete destruction, especially against modern anti-tank weapons. Poor doctrine ensures that these tanks often lack adequate infantry support to prevent ambushes, a fact which is shown over and over again at the hands of Ukrainian soldiers armed with portable anti-tank equipment and drones. Finally, poor Russian logistics ensures that tanks often cannot be recovered, repaired, or fueled, which is why so many of them have been abandoned or captured. Russia may have had the world's largest tank force before the war, but it's lost its best tanks at a staggering rate, with events proving that they were not so great after all. Tanks still may be a formidable force on the modern battlefield, but without proper infantry support, they are vulnerable, and without logistical support, they are for all practical purposes immobile. Russia is therefore left with a rapidly aging tank force, which it's throwing en masse into an attritional meat grinder, hoping to bleed Ukraine out so it becomes too exhausted to fight any further, the traditional Russian way of war. What else do you think is responsible for Russia's huge tank failures in Ukraine? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.